Hello and welcome to the H2P podcast here on DK Pittsburgh Sports. I'm Gary Morgan. With me, as always, the beat writer for Pitt Athletics over at DK Pittsburgh Sports, Corey Crisson. How you doing, brother? It's been a while.
Yeah, good morning, Gary. Good to have you back. The last few weeks have been like crazy in terms of timing because when Pitt
Yeah,
basketball plays Saturdays at different times and like they play at 7 o'clock, I said it on the show. I'm not going to bother you at 9 p.m.
yeah,
That's late. We don't need to be firing up the microphones 9:30 at night, 10:30, midnight, whenever it is. I'm not going to bother you on those. So
well, that's
that
not the kind of
explains.
dedication these people want to hear. But,
Well, no, it's not
but
even. It's not about that. It's just about like the timing of everything because I get home at infinite time. Like it doesn't
right.
it doesn't always line up. So things change at the drop of a hat. Sometimes it's how the industry goes, but good to have you back, Gary.
Well, speaking of change, that's where we're going to start. New offensive coordinator in town, Kade Bell. You finally had an opportunity to get him in front of the press and see him answer some questions and talk about his offensive philosophy. I have a few things that I thought were pretty interesting that came out of it, but I'm interested in hearing your take more. So, what did you think, first of all?
Everything about the Cade Bell offense that we've heard of from other players, Pat Narduzzi, is that they want to play fast and find ways to score fast. I admire that concept. I think that's a concept that maybe should have been employed by the previous coordinator. And it certainly was, when Mark Whipple had Kenny Pickett as well. But you look at what they're doing in terms of building this offense and trying to somewhat replicate what Cade Bell's done in his previous stops. Like at Division Two, he was really successful with calling offenses. He was successful at doing it at Western Carolina for 3 seasons. And keep in mind, he's only 30 years old. Like, that's
Yeah,
really unheralded for hiring an offensive coordinator at this level. He's 30 years old. And so when you have a guy that can connect with players like that and it can build an offense that sort of embodies this era of college football that moves so quickly. Like when you think of they say the tagline SEC speed. Like there's a reason why they say that. There's a reason why it's branded that way. And when you look at what Pitt's offense was the last couple of years under Frank Signetti, it was stuck in the mud compared to what Cade Bell is at least talking about doing. And I think that backing up all of that by bringing in his top receiver, his top running back, and his offensive line coach from Western Carolina. And he talked about like the consistency of building the offensive line and how at this level you have to be strong in the trenches first. I love that because he backed it up by bringing in his offensive line coach. And then he brings in his top receiver. He brings in his top running back from the portal. So I think that when you listen to what Cade Bell had to say about building this Pitt offense, his head's in the right place. It's going to be a procedural thing. This isn't automatically going to be the best offense in the ACC this year. And he did talk about the quarterbacks too, which I think is another thing we can note later on.
sure. Another thing that he talked about was, wanting to get up on the line and get the ball snapped quickly. This is very reminiscent of Todd Graham. And Todd Graham was a painful point for a lot of Pitt fans that we don't like to think back to very often.
Mm-hmm.
The offense didn't go well. His high octane offense, as he called it, was anything but. And he was basically asking slow players to move quickly. So is Cade going to be a little bit less rigid with the application of some of his concepts like that? Like, it takes a while to get the kind of personnel you need to run an offense like that. And I wonder how forgiving and adaptable his concepts are to maybe not having that personnel.
Yeah, he's not going to have all of the pieces in place right away. He's going to have to find the offensive linemen, the quarterback, the receivers, the running, all of these pieces that are going to contribute to his philosophy and his style. That's the cyclical part of college football. It's that they're going to have to, once you make a staff change, they're going to have to find the players and take the time to find the players that are going to fit. That's why when you look at bringing in CJ Lee at wide receiver and bringing in Desmond Reed at running back, like on the surface, you might think, well, those guys were only good enough for the FCS level. The way I see it is, if Kade Bell's offense is as advertised and it's as fast as it wants to be and it's going to translate to this level, then maybe the skill sets from Lee and Reed can also translate to this level. And maybe they're not going to lead Pitt in receiving and rushing, respectively, but they could be heavy contributors to this offense right away.
Yeah.
How fast can Konate Mumfield and Rodney Hammond and all of these other pieces, Gavin Bartholomew, pick up this offense? Those are going to be the other impact pieces on this offense next year. No more Bub Means. Of course, Izzy Abanikanda, we're 2 years removed from him by this point. Like, I think that Pitt had to find a way to supplement quickly what Kade Bell was going to do. And this is kind of how college football goes now, where a coaching move happens and the player either follows them or doesn't. And I feel like when you have the players that follow the offensive coordinator in an important move like this, like a position coach would be different. I think it would be on a significantly less level. When you have these impact pieces following the coordinator, that speaks volumes to, number one, the coordinator, number two, how important those two guys are going to be for this offense.
Yeah, and I would agree with that. The other person that he mentioned a lot and talked a lot about was Gavin Bartholomew. It sounded like he had an actual plan for utilizing him, and I can't imagine that this went into Gavin's decision to not enter the portal, because I doubt that he knew Kade Bell's name when he made that decision. But it's nice to hear. I think we've heard that they want to use the tight end a lot. I don't think we've ever seen them actually do it. So what is Kade Bell going to do differently to incorporate Gavin Bartholomew more?
Well, he's got to treat Gavin like he's a top option, which Gavin is, in my opinion. In my opinion, Gavin's the second best receiving option on this team behind CJ Lee. And I think the malpractice, and that's the word I'll use for it, from Frank Signetti on being as slow as his offense was, it wasn't an offense that was going to benefit a weapon like a tight end could be. And we know how much Pat Narduzzi likes to run the ball, and he liked to use a Gavin Bartholomew in those situations. Like, I think that when you look at this tight end position between Gavin, Overman, the transfer, Jake Renda, like, Gavin's the clear-cut top guy. He's the clear-cut number one. And they have to find ways to get Gavin in space down the field. I don't want to overcomplicate this situation, because, quite frankly, we're coming from an area of nothing. We're coming from an area where Frank Signetti simply did not use Gavin as often as he definitely should have, but also in the manners that he should have. Gavin wasn't running down the seam that often. He wasn't opening up space in the intermediate and in the deep routes. He wasn't running downfield as much. And I think that even just changing the way Gavin Bartholomew runs routes and changing where he goes on the field is going to be enough of an impact for this offense. I think it's almost an elementary step to a point where anybody who looked at this Frank Signetti offense said, well, why aren't they doing anything with this kid? And it's a matter of doing something with him now. It's not about finding ways to use him better. It's about finding ways to actually use him.
Right. All right. Hey, let's take a quick break here. And when we come back, let's talk a little bit more about what he had to say about the quarterback position. All right. We're back to the H2P podcast here on DK Pittsburgh Sports. Corey and Gary with you. We're going to pick up talking about more Kade Bell and talk about what he thought about the quarterback position in particular. Obviously, an area of interest, Corey. So if he's going to ask somebody to run what he considers to be an NFL-style offense, chances are you probably need a pretty good quarterback for that. What do you think that he thinks of the position group right now, and should we expect anything to change?
It was refreshing to hear a committal to Nate Yarnell. And by that, I mean he actually said Nate Yarnell's name as quarterback one going into spring camp. I don't think we've gotten anything as direct like that from Pitt in quite a while. It was we're going to compete. We're going to have Nate and Christian and, mention all of the quarterbacks' names, even down to the freshman that's going to redshirt. Like, it was refreshing to hear a concept of Nate is our guy going into the spring. It was an expression of confidence from Kade Bell and Nate Yarnell. He liked what he saw in the tape. That's what he said. Nate, I thought, for my money, in the last 2 games of the season that he started, put together good tape and had good games. And, when one of those games was the reason why Pitt won, and in the other one was the reason why Pitt had a chance to win it. So when you think about the quarterback position between Nate Yarnell, Christian Veillere, if you want to include Ty Diefenbach and Julian Duggar in the conversation, and then, of course, Eli Holstein, the Alabama transfer. Like, it would be easy to sit here and say, well, Holstein was committed to Alabama. Holstein was a 4-star prospect. He should be given the keys to the car. Kade Bell really didn't mention Holstein's name. He didn't really mention Christian's name. This was about Nate. Yeah. And I think he even used the phrase that it was Nate's to lose come spring camp. So I think
it's very early to say that. Early to say that,
it is.
Right?
When you say that in January, it was still, I think, January at the time, or February.
Yeah, right.
Early February, point is. When you say that this early in the process, you could tell that Kade Bell came in here with the idea that he wants to work with Nate Yarnell, and with the idea that he wants to find a way to develop Nate Yarnell. And he's right. When you look at the tape from the last couple of games, Nate was good. And we sat here after those last 2 games of the season against Boston College and Duke, and we said Nate was good. And I wrote about it after the Duke game. I said, listen, Pat Narduzzi called it a 14-page list of things to fix in the offseason. The quarterback position was not one to fix. Nate is a guy you could build around. And I think that when you have Kade Bell coming in to interview or any of these coordinator candidates interviewing for this position, like, you have to think Nate Yarnell's a part of the conversation. This is almost like a parallel to the Steelers talk that I'm doing with Kenny Pickett. Like, when they were looking to hire an offensive coordinator, they hire Arthur Smith, but Kenny Pickett's in the conversation. Kenny Pickett is the conversation. How can you get the best out of Kenny Pickett? Well, how can Kade Bell get the best out of Nate Yarnell? If the solution to unlocking Nate Yarnell is playing faster, okay, here we go. But that's going to have to be determined in spring camp. But nonetheless, regardless of how it shakes out, I liked the committal and the public backing that Kade Bell did. He stuck his neck out there for Nate Yarnell, and we haven't seen anybody really do that, really ever, for Nate Yarnell. So I'm intrigued just by that concept alone.
There's been one other question about the offense. These fast-moving offenses, I think, even when they're successful, they have a tendency to tire out the defense, and I mean your defense, not the opposing defense. They're on the field a lot more. I already feel Narduzzi's defenses tend to stay on the field a little longer than they should, and rely very much on turnovers and splash plays to kind of stop themselves from being stuck on long drives. Is that anything that we should be concerned about?
I think it can be, and I think the concern would be because if this offense is going to move as quickly as advertised, then that is going to happen. That's just going to be an organic fallout, an organic effect of having an offense that moves quickly as it wants to. Now, could this change how Pat Narduzzi recruits for his defense? Maybe. Could this change who Pat Narduzzi deploys out there as far as packages, as far as personnel? Yeah, I think it definitely will. I think this is going to be a challenge for Pat Narduzzi. And think about the coordinators he's hired in the past, right? Offenses typically were slower tempo. Offenses had ball control. They had clock control, run heavy. This is going to be different. Okay, it's not that Kade Bell's not going to run the ball, because he even wants to run the ball. But when you have a defense that is on the field as often as Pitt's defense is, and they have to sub in because players are tired, okay, that's going to be a court to work around. But now Pat Narduzzi is going to be challenged and tasked with, well, if this offense is not going to control the ball for as long as you would like, and the defense is going to be on the field for a longer period of time, then all right, how do I adjust? How do I recruit? And how do I coach differently? And you have the defensive staff all in place except for one major piece, which we're going to talk about here
Yeah,
shortly.
right.
But I think this is going to be a great challenge for Pat Narduzzi. I don't really have a solution as to what Pat could do,
Sure.
but I'm sure this is something he's considered with bringing in a coordinator that is a different style compared to what he's brought in and is comfortable with.
I'm interested to see it. And the other question I have, just one more about the offense here before we switch gears a little bit. I wonder sometimes with these tempo offenses, you tend to not sub packages very much because you're trying to trap the defense on the field is what you're trying to do more than anything. That and create a little bit of tempo for yourself. So you don't sub packages so that they can't sub packages. Well, that locks you in to a certain degree, right? You have certain groups of players that are out there at all times. This team has traditionally loved swapping running backs in the middle of series, swapping, how many tight ends they're playing, are they going with a big package? They do all kinds of different things like that. You're going to not see things like that this year, I would imagine, correct?
I don't think so. It depends on how much no huddle they go. It depends on how much tempo they actually want to play with. Now, I would think that what they're going to do as far as employing and deploying these packages is having a script, so to speak, maybe not a literal script, but having kind of this way of like, okay, on this drive, here's how we're going to handle it. And by that, we're going to deploy out this running back. We're going to use these tight ends. We're going to use this receiver, and you guys have to be ready. And I think that, like, of course, other coordinators do this. I'm not like bringing anything new here into the forefront. But what I mean by that is it's going to be more deliberate and more committed to. And it's going to be something that this offense kind of lives off of in a way. Now, who are going to be those players and how are they going to utilize? Maybe they do more 2 running back sets with Hammond and Reed. Maybe they do more 3. Maybe they do less 3 wide, and maybe they use Gavin in the slot more, which is something I begged for last year. I think, like, put Gavin in the slot. Think about it this way: if you have personnel where you have Gavin in the slot, Mumpfield and Lee on the outside on the boundaries, and you have Reed or Hammond or both in the backfield, pretty good use of your skill weapons. Let's be frank; they're not deep at wide receiver right now.
Yeah,
so they're going to have to get creative with their wide receivers and get creative with who's out there as that wide receiver 3. So, like, they have to consider that depth too. Like, the running back room, I think, is really deep. I think the tight end room is basically just Gavin, and I think the receivers room needs a couple pieces as well, a piece. Like, I like Dejan Reynolds, but he needs to take another step. So
yeah, I would agree with all that.
It depends on exactly what they want to do. And I think when you look at a tempo offense, Mumpfield and Lee are going to be more suited for that than Reynolds is. So it just kind of depends on the flow, and it depends on what exactly they want to do on a given series, I think.
Right. And I think Gavin Bartholomew, not to hash all about him, we go back to him, though, they kept him into blocks so much that he just wasn't in a lot of routes. And when he was, I guess the best way to put it is he didn't get college open. He was getting NFL open in college. And I just don't think that we've had a quarterback here really since Pickett that could throw that ball or would throw that ball. And I think he needs to get wide to get those opportunities. So hopefully that's something that changes a little bit with the familiarity that Yarnell does have with him already. I think it's something maybe they could pick up and run with.
Mm-hmm.
All right, let's stick with football, but let's switch gears a little.
Sure.
Because I don't want to get into recruiting. I personally don't think it's all that interesting anymore with the portal. I think it's kind of like lost a little bit of its luster for me. It's hard for me to get excited about a guy that is going to come in and start next year, trying to be a football player when really they're going to go to the portal and get somebody that's going to start, right?
You're not alone in that thought either.
Well, it's changed things for me, so I don't focus as much. That said, they just lost arguably their best recruiter in Charlie Partridge to the NFL. He's going to the Colts, and good for him. Charlie's been a good coach and a good soldier here, but he's been Pat Narduzzi's right-hand man on the recruiting trail for most of his tenure here.
As an associate head coach too.
Yeah, I mean, what are your thoughts on losing that aspect and his defensive line? He's managed some guys that, you know, have gone on to have successful NFL careers.
Yeah. Well, I'm curious to see if, you know, in a few years when Kovacevic hits free agency, if he becomes a Colt, or, you know, when Patrick Jones or Jalen Twyman hit free agency, if they become Colts, because, I mean, like, that's the impact Charlie Partridge had on these players at Pitt. By the way, this is Pitt losing their two best recruiters now in this offseason. When you look at Tim Salem as well, Tim Salem did wonders for both sides of the ball. And Charlie Partridge, obviously, the talent he brought in and developed. And I think it's more about the development of that defensive line. I mean, case in point is Kovacevic. When you have a 3-star prospect, undersized, as they say, defensive tackle, and he becomes what he is now, ACC Defensive Player of the Year, had a pretty good rookie campaign in the NFL once he got healthy. Like, that's Charlie Partridge. That's his effect. And, like, even just from watching practices, Charlie runs that room differently. And I don't mean that as a slight to any of the other Pitt assistant coaches, because those guys are at this level for a reason. But you could tell the way Partridge did things and kind of the way that he held his linemen to. If the reps weren't perfect, he made him do it again. If the reps weren't up to par, he made sure that they stopped everything to correct it. Like, and I think that when you look at the room as a whole, like, he never brought in the big splash prospect. He was a good recruiter, which is why this defensive line, you know, led the country in sacks not long ago and has been second and third and consistently top 5 since he got to Pitt. But, like, it's the development of all of those players. And that's going to be the thing that Pitt misses the most when it comes to defensive line coaches. Now,
he ran some pretty advanced concepts for college.
Yes,
too.
That like, too.
The defensive line in college, just for a lot of people that don't pay much attention, it really can be as simple as bull rush. Bull rush and you know, the edge guys, hey, lock down the edge. That's all they teach. They're not teaching like twists and stunts and things like that, at least not on a high level, right? I remember an interview with Sebastian Dennis a couple of years ago where he talked about how the defensive line at Pitt is coached to open holes for the rushers. Like, that doesn't happen everywhere. So I do think they lose something here pretty big, at least as far as some of their coaching talent goes. Pat Narduzzi, I'm sure, is not unaware. And when he hires somebody, I'm sure he got somebody that can teach that same kind of thing, because it's important to his defense.
And Pat Narduzzi said he has a couple of names in mind that can replace Partridge. So we'll see what direction they go. Could it be an in-house thing? Maybe, like a GA from last year, or just somebody Pat knows and trusts closely. Like, we know how Pat likes to approach his coaching staff by this point. He likes to kind of find some familiarity there. And I think that there's a certain brand that Pat's defense employs that requires a specific style of coach. I think that's why Charlie Partridge works so well with Pat Narduzzi. And again, they're not just losing a D-line coach. Charlie Partridge on game days was also Pat Narduzzi's right-hand man. So We'll see exactly what they do, how they recruit from this. But losing the two biggest recruiters and the two, in my opinion, most important assistants on the staff, when you look at Tim Salem and Charlie Partridge, it's going to be a hard thing for Pat Narduzzi to overcome.
Sure. And it also speaks highly to Pat Narduzzi's, you know, coaching tree. I think he's done a good job of bringing guys along and releasing them out into the world. So one more little hunk of football news before we take another break here. In that whole thing, Narduzzi basically said he has zero interest in going to the NFL. Just wanted to know if you thought anything about that, because it does seem to be something that is becoming more prevalent in college football, where coaches are basically saying, well, this is how it's going to be. Well, maybe it's not harder to go to the NFL than it is to be here and do this.
Yeah. I believe every word of what Pat Narduzzi said, by the way, of him not wanting to go to the NFL. I think if he wanted to, he might have by now, or at least would have explored that opportunity by now. Or think of it this way too. people talk, like inside the buildings, people talk. There would have been a gauge by now from some NFL team. Pat Narduzzi's been at Pitt for 9 years now.
Yeah.
There would have been some gauge, even after, especially after the 21 season when they won the ACC title, of Pat Narduzzi becoming some team's defensive coordinator.
Oh, there's no way Mike Tomlin wouldn't have found a job for it. You know how he loves to point down the hallway at Pitt, drag somebody over.
But like the point is like he would have been talked about or sought after or whatever buzzword you want to use by some NFL team, especially like I said, after the 21 season. If Pat Narduzzi, and by the way, if Pat Narduzzi is as good at developing talent and is as good at running the defenses and is good at getting the best out of those players on that side of the ball as he is, and he is, then some team would have definitely hired him by this point. He's done this college football thing at the Power 5 level for a long time by this point. Now, timing is also of the essence, if you want to put it that way too. The right thing would have to come up. But also, we would have heard like, oh, Pat Narduzzi's being looked at for the Patriots DC job, or he's being looked at for the Steelers DC job, or like whatever DC job. We haven't really seen any of that come out in the last several years. So like, if it would have happened, maybe it would have happened by now. And also, if Pat doesn't want to go to the NFL, which I believe every word of what he said about not wanting to go to the NFL, then okay. So yeah, I think he's going to be a college football lifer, and there's nothing wrong with that.
Yeah, I wouldn't want to go anywhere either if I had one of the most secure jobs in college football. Like he has just not even really been threatened to go anywhere, regardless of what he's pulled off on the field. Mm-hmm. Let's take another quick break here. Let's come back. Let's wrap up with hoops, right? All right, welcome back to the H2P podcast here on DK Pittsburgh Sports. Corey and Gary, and we're going to finally switch over to basketball. It felt nice to talk a little football, though, honestly. I know you've been talking NFL football, but it was nice talking a little college football.
Always, yeah.
Couple things. First, let's start with Jorge Diaz-Graham undergoing surgery on his left ankle. He's going to miss the rest of the season. He hasn't played much. The ankle has really been limiting him. He hasn't been the same. It's funny when you have a twin on the team, it's really easy to see like, hey, he's not as fast as him. Genetically, that shouldn't be the case. So like there's something wrong there. And it's good that they're getting it taken care of. I wish that Federico was playing better so that I could not worry about this as much as I am.
Yeah. Well, and Jeff Capel kind of said it. They use Jorge as more of a stretch four than anything else, which is great. But also, and I mentioned this on last week's show, so I won't go too in deep in this. Like Jorge was a body to have. He was somebody that if they needed to plug somebody into the 4 or the 5, they could.
Yeah.
With Jorge. And like you said, if Federico was playing better, you'd feel a little bit better, maybe, or less down, so to speak, about Jorge being out for the season. But Jorge, he's played about 10 minutes a game, I think it was. He wasn't scoring insanely amount of numbers. He wasn't rebounding insane amount. He was a reserve piece for this team. He was a, end of the rotation kind of guy. And I said this on last week's show. I think the biggest impact is the numbers. It's now Pitt has 10 scholarship players to dress for the last month of the season. That's a big deal to me. That's when you go into March, you need depth, you need numbers. And, how long can Pitt keep this thing going when the numbers are getting low now, especially when you think of Mike Hewitt leaving?
It was the most unlikely run in the world last year because they had worse numbers than that last year. Mm-hmm. And they managed to go into the NCAAs where they really probably had no business going with that kind of depth. And I really mean, we talked about it all year and we marveled about it last year. But to really sit back and look at it, and right now we're going like, oh man, down to 10. We only had 7 last year. Like at times, like
right.
Like it's an amazing feat what they pulled off last year. So, it's not great to lose depth. That said, the depth has been kind of tested, and some of what I thought was depth is kind of shining and rising towards the top. They've now won 5 out of their last 6. 6-6 in the ACC. They've risen from the dead. They're that Undertaker gif, right? Just like lifted up out of the coffin.
Right.
I can hear that's the organ music right now. And all of a
WrestleMania is
sudden,
coming up soon.
and all of a sudden, Jalen Lowe is kind of getting a lot of the buzz that Bub Carrington was getting early on. And I'm not going to say that Bub has completely fallen off the table. Let's just say he's shown he's not ready for the duty they were asking him to carry out, I would say. But as a bit player, he's still dropping, double digits here and contributing, and he looks like he's getting a little more comfortable distributing the ball. But Jalen Lowe has jumped him big time.
I would agree. And I've talked about Jalen's impact and against in the Duke game especially. Like, look at the plays, not just scoring and putting up numbers, but situationally. I think Jalen Lowe has really shined for Pitt. He has been really good down this stretch of winning, in recent memory. And now, when I look at the plays that he's made in the second half and down these wire minutes of the game, like against NC State, he made the big plays. Against Duke, he made the big plays. And then he put up big numbers in other games in recent time. So, I think Jalen's development has been a major factor for what Jeff Capel's been able to do with respect to his backcourt. And I think the best move that Jeff Capel's made this season was putting Lowe into the starting lineup over Ish Leggett. And we thought of Leggett as a really impactful piece. He still is. He's like a Jamarius Burton light, if you will. And I think that's a really nice piece to have off the bench. The concern for me with this team, not just within the numbers in the front court, but it's the ability to score inside. I feel oftentimes they try to get inside and then almost get scared out of it and resort, not really resort, but and find a different way to find an outside look or find a way to find a mid-range look. Like their paint presence, I think, is lacking. And again, when you're losing Jorge Diaz-Graham and Federico's development is hindered and you haven't really gotten as much as you thought maybe out of Guillermo this year, that's what's going to happen. Their front court has to play better down the stretch if they're going to consistently, sustain winning.
I like Guillermo. I think he could develop into a good inside player if he really, really focused on it. But he won't focus on it because it's just not the way those players are brought up.
Sure.
Those players are brought up to be good at everything. They should be able to shoot threes. They should be able to act as a point guard if they have to. They should be that's the way they're taught. So I just don't think you're going to beat that out of them. And I don't think that I don't think you're doing the kid any favors by forcing it on him. Federico is the big scary disappointment because he got bigger, and I think that's what a lot of us thought was going to be his biggest development tool, getting a little bigger so he couldn't get bullied around under there. Problem is, he's still playing basketball under the hoop like a kid that can get bullied around.
Mm-hmm.
He's not using his muscle, and when he does, he gets in foul trouble.
I don't want to say he's regressed either because I don't think that's the case, but I think it's just been a plateau. I think he's plateaued this year, and that has limited what Pitt has been able to do within its front court.
Now, see, I would say regressed because I truly think he is detrimental to the cause when he's on the court at times, and I didn't feel that when he was at his rawest of raw last year. I felt like this year he's actually hurting the offense, and mostly because of what you said. They can get it inside to him. You just can't trust he's going to do anything with it when it's in there. Right. And he certainly ain't kicking it back out. That said, Pitt Hoops is alive again, and we're going to go ahead with that Undertaker theme for a minute and let them try it out and see how it progresses. I'm not excited yet, but they are starting to get some NCAA buzz again, and that's nice to hear at least. They have a lot of work to do in the ACC. That Duke win was huge. It was just huge.
It saved the season. It saved the season is what it did. I still don't view this as a tournament team. When I look at the makeup of an NCAA tournament team, I just don't see it here.
I'm with you, Corey, but I'm just happy that the hope's alive again.
Well, that being said, yeah, they could put this late season surge together, maybe win a couple of games in the ACC tournament and get right back into it. So, like last year, I think when you look at the feel of building that resume, they were able to do it consistently across the entire span of the season. They had a really bad stretch at the beginning of the year and obviously started 1-5 in ACC play.
Yeah.
So that's the thing that if they don't make the tournament is going to hurt them. If they play well in this last month of the season and play their way back in, okay, great. And they have a chance to do that. They just have to really rattle off some really impressive wins here to close out the last month.
Yeah. Hey, good stuff, man. Sorry we went a little long. That's my bad because we haven't talked in a while and I had a lot in my head. So,
well, hey, don't we all? Who's winning the Super Bowl?
Chiefs.
I agree.
I can't go against Patrick Mahomes. I just don't see it. And I saw a stat the other day that he and Kelsey have played, I believe, the equivalent of 15 games together in the playoffs. And they only have something like 20 incompletions.
True.
Like, those two are 100% to me the best tandem in the modern era.
Yeah.
Even better than Gronk and Brady.
Yeah. Good point. Good point here. One Pitt Hoops point here for Patrick on Twitter who chimes in. Says the Syracuse losses are brutal. Yes, they are.
For Pitt. Not for all of us, but yeah. Not for all of us, but
yeah, I was okay with them. Benny Williams. How about did you see that? Benny Williams got dismissed. That was a situation. If you don't know what happened, Syracuse forward Benny Williams was dismissed from the team. Just go back and watch the end of the Wake Forest game and how he and Red Autry kind of reacted to each other. And then not long after, big press release came out. So I don't know what was said or what happened, but that's a loss for Syracuse. But yeah, as Patrick says here, for Pitt basketball, those two losses to Syracuse are pretty bad.
I would agree. Yeah. Hey, let's end the show the way we always do, though. H2P.